Welcome to today's video, where we explore a shocking incident in American history. A racist cop mistakenly arrested a black female FBI agent. And what happened next is nothing short of incredible. This story is not only about an unusual incident, but also a stark reminder of racism in law enforcement. When things come to a head, who will stand up for truth and justice? Let's dig in. Renee Carter, a highly skilled FBI agent with a storied career, walked briskly through the dimly lit streets of the city. It was late, well past midnight, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped through the fabric of her hoodie. She was dressed simply: gray jogging pants, a black hoodie, and sneakers. Her appearance gave no indication of her true identity to anyone passing by. She looked like a typical pedestrian, perhaps someone taking a shortcut home after a late-night errand, but appearances could be deceiving. Renee had just completed a grueling 14-hour operation. Her team had been tracking an elusive criminal network specializing in cyber crimes, and the mission had required hours of painstaking surveillance, negotiations, and strategic planning. Though the operation had been a success with multiple arrests and the seizure of critical evidence, Renee's body was heavy with exhaustion. She craved nothing more than the solitude of her apartment and the comfort of a warm shower, but her car had run low on fuel and she needed to make a stop at the only gas station open at this hour, one located in a less than desirable part of the city. It wasn't her usual route, but her tank was nearly empty and she had no choice as she approached the small convenience store attached to the gas station. Renee scanned her surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had been trained to notice the smallest details. The street was eerily quiet save for the flickering of a faulty street lamp and the occasional distant sound of a car engine. The store itself looked rundown, with a cracked neon sign and smudged glass windows. Inside, a bored-looking cashier scrolled through their phone behind a scratched plexiglass barrier. Renee didn't linger. She entered quickly, grabbed a bottle of water and an energy bar from the shelves, and made her way to the counter. She paid with cash, deliberately avoiding using her card. Though she wasn't on duty, her instincts as an agent never truly switched off. She knew better than to leave a digital trail, especially in areas like this where criminals often lurked. With her purchase in hand, she stepped back into the night and began walking toward her car, parked just a few feet away from the store. In trance, her movements were deliberate but relaxed, the kind of calm that came from years of being in high-stake situations. Still, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. Across the street, a police cruiser idled in the shadows, its headlights off, blending into the darkness. Inside the car sat Officer Todd Stevens, a man known within the department for his volatile temper and questionable tactics. Todd was in his mid-30s, a patrol officer who had spent over a decade working the same circuit in the city's more troubled neighborhoods. But unlike other officers who sought to serve their communities, Todd harbored a simmering resentment. He believed that certain areas and the people in them were beyond redemption, and that it was his job to keep them in line. Over the years, his biases had hardened, manifesting in ways that skirted the boundaries of acceptable police behavior. Todd had been watching Renee since she entered the store. Something about her presence irritated him. She didn't look like she belonged there. Her clothes were plain, but there was a confidence in her wore that he didn't like. To him, she seemed too comfortable in an area where most people avoided eye contact and moved quickly to their destinations. His mind raced with assumptions. Was she here to buy drugs? Was she casing the gas station for a robbery? Whatever the reason, Todd decided that she needed to be put in her place. Without turning on his lights, Todd pulled his cruiser out of the shadows and slowly rolled across the street toward the gas station parking lot. Renee, now standing next to her car, noticed the movement. Immediately she glanced at the approaching vehicle and saw the police insignia on its side. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't the first time she'd been in a situation like this. As a black woman who had worked her way up through the ranks of law enforcement, she was no stranger to being underestimated or outright harassed, but tonight she was too tired for a confrontation. Todd parked his car diagonally across the lot, effectively blocking her from driving away. He stepped out of the cruiser with exaggerated slowness, adjusting his belt and letting his hand rest casually on the holster of his service weapon. His posture was confrontational, designed to intimidate. Renee leaned against her car, her water bottle in one hand, and watched him approach. Her FBI training taught her to stay calm even when provoked, and she wasn't about to give this man the satisfaction of rattling her evening. Todd set his tone sharp and devoid of politeness. His eyes swept over her, lingering on her hoodie and jogging pants. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Renee met his gaze evenly. "Getting gas," she replied simply, her voice calm but firm. She didn't elaborate, knowing that anything she said could be twisted into an excuse for further interrogation. Todd raised an eyebrow, clearly unsatisfied with her response. "This isn't exactly the safest neighborhood," he said, taking a step Closer you live around here. Renee didn't answer right away. She felt the tension in his stance, the barely concealed hostility. Officer, she said finally, her tone measured. Is there a problem? Todd's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people, especially women, speaking to him like that. That depends, he said, his voice hardening. Mind if I take a look in your car? Renee's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained composed. I do mind, she said, unless you have warrant or probable cause. I prefer to go about my evening. That was the wrong answer as far as Todd was concerned. His face flushed with anger and he took another step forward, his hand now fully gripping his holster. Look, I don't know who you think you are, he said, his voice rising, but you don't get to make the rules here. Step away from the car. Renee didn't move. Her instincts screamed at her to de-escalate, but she also knew that appeasement would only embolden him. Officer, she said, her voice cool and steady, I'm going to ask you to back up. You're overstepping. Todd's patience snapped in one swift motion. He closed the distance between them and grabbed her arm, yanking her away from the car. The suddenness of the action sent her water bottle clattering to the ground, but before he could assert his dominance further, Renee's years of training kicked in. She pivoted on her heel, breaking his grip with a precise movement that left him momentarily stunned. I'm warning you, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Todd froze, his eyes widening as he registered the steel in her tone, but instead of backing down, he doubled down, reaching for his baton. Renee's body tensed, ready for whatever came next. She knew this wasn't going to end without a fight. Todd's fingers tightened around the handle of his baton as his frustration boiled over. He was used to people complying instantly when he gave an order, especially when he made it clear he wasn't playing around. But this woman, this infuriatingly calm, confident woman, wasn't reacting the way he expected. She didn't look scared, she didn't look apologetic. If anything, she seemed to be silently measuring him, as though she were the one in control of the situation. That made his blood boil even more. He wasn't going to let her walk away without proving who was in charge here. Renee could see it all play out in his body language, the slight twitch of his jaw, the way his nostrils flared, the tightening of his grip on the baton. She had seen this kind of aggression before in countless field situations where someone's ego or unchecked anger took control, but this time it was personal. She wasn't just observing it from a safe distance, she was in the center of it, and though her mind raced with potential strategies to de-escalate, she knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move could make things spiral out of control. I said, step away from the car. Todd barked, his voice sharp and filled with venom. He raised the baton slightly as if to emphasize his point. The unspoken threat hung heavily in the air. Renee didn't flinch. Her hands were at her sides, her posture relaxed, but her muscles were coiled like springs, ready to react if necessary. Her training, echoed in her mind, remained calm. Don't escalate, assess the threat. Officer, she said evenly, her voice firm but devoid of any over hostility. I've already told you I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not going to step away from my car unless you can provide a lawful reason for this. Stop. Todd's eyes narrowed. Her calm defiance was like a slap in the face. He was used to people stumbling over themselves to obey him, especially when he turned up the pressure, but she wasn't budging. She was challenging his authority in a way that felt almost deliberate, and he hated it. He took another step closer, closing the gap between them until he was looming over her. You think you're smarter than me, he sneered, his voice low and dripping with contempt. You think you can just mouth off to a cop and walk away? Renee tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. No, she replied simply, I think I can stand up for my rights. That's not a crime, at least it shouldn't be. Her words struck a nerve. Todd's face darkened and his knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the baton. Let me tell you something, he spat, his voice rising. You don't get to decide what a crime I do, and I'm telling you right now you're acting suspicious as hell, so unless you want me to take you in, you better start cooperating. The threat hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. Renee's heart was pounding now, not with fear but with adrenaline. She knew she was walking a fine line. If she pushed back too hard, Todd would escalate. If she stayed silent, he'd take it as a sign of weakness and push even harder. Either way, she was in a now-and situation, but that didn't mean she was powerless. Suspicious of what exactly, she asked, her tone measured but challenging. Buying a bottle of water, parking my car, being here while black. You need to be very careful about what you're accusing me of, officer. Todd's lip curled into a sneer. You think you're funny, huh? You think throwing the race card is going to get you out of this? Newsflash, it's not. He stepped even closer, his face inches from hers now, his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You don't belong here, and I don't care what kind of excuses you come up with. You're going to regret messing with me. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Renee could feel the heat of his breath, see the unbridled rage simmering in his eyes. She knew exactly what was coming next, and her mind raced through her options. She could try to walk away, but he'd likely stop her with force. She could call for backup, but her phone was in the car, and reaching for it would Only give him an excuse to accuse her of resisting, or she could wait for him to make the first move and use his aggression against him before she could decide. Todd made the choice for her. With a sudden violent motion he swung the baton toward her midsection, aiming to knock her off balance, but Renee was ready. Her reflexes, honed by years of training, kicked in instinctively. She sidestepped the blow with fluid precision, her body moving faster than Todd anticipated. The baton sliced through the air, missing her by mere inches. Todd stumbled, slightly caught off guard by her speed, his face twisted in frustration as he swung again, this time aiming for her shoulder, but Renee was already moving, her body a blur as she ducked under the strike and stepped back, putting a safe distance between them. Stand still, Todd shouted, his voice cracking with rage. He lunged forward, his movements wild and uncoordinated, his composure completely unraveling. Renee didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any words could be. It was a calculated silence designed to throw him further off balance, and it worked. Todd's anger blinded him, making him wreck. He swung again and again, each strike more desperate than the last, each one missing its mark. Finally Todd stopped, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Sweat dripped down his forehead and his grip on the baton wavered. He looked at Renee with a mix of fury and disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend how she was still standing untouched and unshaken. What the hell are you? He muttered, his voice low and hoarse. Renee took a slow, deliberate step forward, her gaze locked onto his, and for the first time Todd saw something in her eyes that made his stomach churn. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something far more dangerous. Control. I'm someone you should have left alone, she said, her voice calm and steady, and if you don't put that baton down right now, you're going to find out exactly why. Todd hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. He glanced around the parking lot as though searching for anyone who could back him up, but the lot was empty and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. He was alone, and for the first time he realized just how badly he had miscalculated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. With a growl of frustration he raised the baton again, ready to swing, but before he could, Renee moved. She closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist. Her grip was like steel, unyielding and impossible to shake off. Todd's eyes widened in shock as she twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the baton with a clatter. The next thing he knew, he was on the ground, his face pressed against the cold pavement, his arm pinned painfully behind his back, Renee's knee pressed firmly against his shoulder blade, keeping him immobilized. Let me go, Todd shouted, his voice muffled against the pavement. You're assaulting an officer. No, Renee said calmly. I'm defending myself from one. Her words cut through the air like a blade, and for the first time tonight Todd felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Renee kept her knee firmly planted on Todd's shoulder blade as he read beneath her, shouting a stream of insults and empty threats that echoed across the empty gas station parking lot. His words were laced with venom, but Renee was unaffected. She had encountered men like him before, those who wielded power recklessly, believing their authority was absolute. Her years of training had taught her how to deal with such individuals. Stay calm, maintain control, and never let them dictate the situation. She knew that if she gave Todd even an inch, he would use it against her. Get off me, you crazy BCH, Todd bellowed, his voice muffled against the rough pavement. He twisted his body in an attempt to break free, but Renee's grip on his arm was ironclad. He tried to shift his weight and push himself up, but she pressed down harder, keeping him immobilized. You're assaulting a police officer. Do you even know what kind of trouble you're in? Renee leaned forward, slightly lowering her voice so that only he could hear. I don't think you fully grasp the situation you're in. Officer Stevens, you attacked me, you escalated this, and if you keep resisting you're only making it worse for yourself. Her tone was steady, almost clinical, as though she were delivering a lecture rather than restraining a man twice her size. It wasn't meant to antagonize him, it was a calculated move to assert her dominance and make it clear that she was in control. Todd, however, was too consumed by his own rage and humiliation to recognize the shift in power dynamics. Do you have any idea who I am? He spat, craning his neck to glare up at her. You're going to regret this, I swear to God. The moment my boys get here you're done. Renee didn't flinch. She knew he was bluffing. His earlier attempt to call for backup hadn't gone through. Her smartwatch signal jammer had ensured that for all his bravado Todd was alone, and deep down he knew it. Still, his words carried a venom that hinted at his desperation to regain control. You think you're some kind of hero, Todd continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think pinning me down like this makes you tough? You're just another. Careful, Renee cut him off sharply, her voice dropping an octave. Choose your next words wisely, officer. Her warning hung in the air like a loaded gun. Todd hesitated, his MTH opening and closing as he scrambled for a retort. For the first time he seemed to realize that his usual tactics, intimidation, aggression and bluster, weren't working. In fact, they were backfiring spectacularly, but instead of backing down he doubled down on his Arrogance, this is assault, he snarled, plain and simple. You've got no idea the kind of hell that's coming your way. I'll have you arrested before the night's over. You'll be sitting in a cell begging me for mercy. Renee's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. You really don't know when to quit, do you? She released his wrist and stood up in one fluid motion, taking a deliberate step back. Todd, momentarily stunned by the sudden shift, scrambled to his feet, rubbing his shoulder where her knee had pressed into him. His face was red with fury, his eyes wild and bloodshot. For a brief moment he seemed unsure of what to do. His pride demanded retaliation, but the memory of how easily she had disarmed and subdued him was still fresh in his mind. You're going to regret this, he growled, his voice low and menacing. You have no idea who you're messing with. Renee crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, her expression neutral. Then show me, she said simply. Todd took a step forward, his chest heaving as he squared up to her. He was taller and heavier, but she didn't so much as blink. Her calm demeanor only seemed to enrage him further. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white, and for a moment it looked like he was going to lunge at her, but then he hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ground where his baton still lay. Renee followed his line of sight and let out a quiet sigh. Go your head, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. Pick it up, let's see how that works out for you. Todd froze, caught off guard by her response. He hadn't expected her to call his bluff so directly. For a moment his bravado faltered, and he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation in her stance. She was completely at ease, as though she had already calculated, aided every possible outcome, and decided she had nothing to worry about. The realization sent a cold wave of doubt washing over him, but Todd was nothing if not stubborn. He bent down and snatched up the baton, gripping it tightly in his right hand. You asked for it, he snarled, raising the weapon. Renee didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, watching him with the calm detachment of a predator waiting for its prey to make the first mistake. Her silence unnerved him, but he pushed the feeling aside, convincing himself that she was just bluffing. With a roar of frustration he swung the baton toward her head. The next few seconds passed in a blur. Renee ducked under the strike, her movements fluid and precise as Todd stumbled forward from the force of his swing. She stepped to the side and delivered a swift, controlled kick to the back of his knee. The impact sent him crashing to the ground, the baton slipping from his grasp and skittering across the pavement. Todd let out a strangled cry of pain as he landed on his hands and knees, gasping for breath. Before he could recover, Renee moved in, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in one seamless motion. He let out another pained shout as she forced him down, pinning him to the ground once more. This is the second time tonight I've had to put you on the ground, Renee said, her tone cool and matter-of-fact. You might want to start rethinking your approach. Let me go, you psycho, Todd shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. He writhed beneath her, but his struggles were weaker this time, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Renee tightened her grip on his arm, applying just enough pressure to make her point. You've already lost, Officer Stevens. Stop embarrassing yourself. Todd's body went still, his ragged breaths the only sound in the otherwise silent parking lot. For a moment Renee thought he might finally have come to his senses, but then he started laughing, a low bitter chuckle that sent a chill down her spine. You think you're so smart, don't you, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you've got me all figured out, but you're just another. He didn't get to finish his sentence. A sudden noise, a low hum followed by the crunch of tires on gravel, interrupted him. Renee glanced up and saw a pair of headlights cutting through the darkness, a sleek blacks pulled into the parking lot, its tinted windows reflecting the dim light of the street lamp. Todd craned his neck to see who had arrived, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. Who the hell? The SV came to a stop a few feet away and the driver's door opened. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his movements smooth and deliberate. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but Renee recognized him instantly. Relief washed over her, though she didn't let it show. Agent Carter, the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. Everything under control here? Renee nodded, releasing Todd's arm and stepping back. Yes sir, just handling a minor disturbance. Todd scrambled to his feet, glaring at the newcomer. Who the hell are you? He demanded, his voice thick with anger. The man stepped into the light, revealing his face, his piercing eyes locked onto Todd's and his expression hardened. Special Agent Collins, he said evenly. FBI. Todd's jaw dropped, his face going pale. FBI, he stammered. What the? Collins ignored him, turning to Renee. You okay? Renee nodded again. I'm fine. Hune's just persistent. Collins glanced at Todd, his gaze cold and unforgiving. I can see that. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but Collins held up a hand, silencing him. Don't bother, we've been monitoring your activities for weeks, Officer Stevens, and tonight you've given us everything we need. Todd's face turned beet red. Monitoring me? What the hell are you talking about? Collins took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You know exactly what I'm talking about, and I suggest you start thinking very carefully about your next Move, because trust me, you're not walking away from this. Todd stared at him, his chest heaving, his mind racing. For the first time he seemed to realize just how deep a hole he had dug for himself, and there was no way out. Renee stood silently, her breath steady as she watched the realization wash over Todd's face like a crashing wave. For the first time that night, the cocky bravado, the seething arrogance, and the misplaced sense of control all seemed to drain from him, leaving behind a man who now understood just how dire his situation had become. The parking lot was silent except for the low rumble of the black SUV's engine and the faint rhythmic sound of Todd's heavy breathing. Special Agent Collins hadn't moved since his last words, standing tall with his hands resting calmly at his sides, his expression unreadable but unmistakably commanding. Todd's gaze darted between Collins and Renee, his mind clearly racing to piece together what had just happened. Monitoring me, he finally repeated, his voice hoarse, but the question came out more as a whisper than the defiant snill he had intended. Collins didn't answer right away. He studied Todd like a predator sizing up weakened prey, letting the we of the silence suffocate him further. When he finally spoke, his tone was deliberate, measured, and laced with quiet authority. You've been under investigation for weeks, Officer Stevens. Complaints about your conduct, patterns of abuse, unreported use of force tonight was just the final piece of the puzzle. Todd blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if trying to wake himself from a bad dream, his arrogance floor briefly a last-ditch effort to regain some sense of control. This is. He spat, his voice cracking slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Yui turned to Renee, pointing a trembling finger. You set me up. This was a setup, wasn't it? Rai didn't react to his accusation. She simply stared at him with that same calm, unyielding gaze that had unnerved him from the beginning. Collins, however, took a step forward and Todd flinched instinctively, his bravado faltering once again. Set you up, Collins repeated, his voice dropping an octave. Let me make something perfectly clear, officer. No one had to set you up. You did this to yourself. Everything you did tonight was your choice, your actions, your words, your decisions, and now you're going to answer for them. Todd's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment it looked as though he might try to run. His gaze darted toward his cruiser, but Renee saw the flicker of thought before it could even fully form. She took one calculated step to the side, positioning herself between him and the vehicle. Don't, she said quietly, her voice firm but without anger. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of inevitability. Todd froze, his shoulders slump pumping slightly as the futility of the situation began to sink in. He clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles white as he glared at Renee with pure hatred. You think you've won, don't you? He hissed. You think you can just walk in here and destroy my career, my life? Renee tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. Your career isn't being destroyed because of me, she said evenly. It's being destroyed because of you. The words hit him like a slap, and for a moment Todd looked as though he might lash out again, but before he could say anything the sound of another engine approached, cutting through the tense silence. A second vehicle pulled into the parking lot, this one a marked FBI. Field units of its headlights illuminated the scene as it came to a stop next to Collins's vehicle. The doors opened and two more agents stepped out, both dressed in plain clothes but unmistakably federal in their demeanor. Right on time, Collins said quietly, his eyes never leaving Todd. He turned slightly toward the newcomers and gestured toward Renee. Agent Carter, anything else to add before we proceed? Renee shook her head, her tone professional. No sir, I've got everything I need. One of the agents, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a noon's demeanor, approached Renee with a slight nod. We'll take it from here, she said, her voice crisp but respectful. She turned her attention to Todd, her expression hardening. Officer Stevens, you're officially being detained as part of an ongoing federal investigation. Please place your hands where I can see them. Todd's face turned a deep shade of red, his eyes darting wildly between the agents and Renee. You can't do this, he said, his voice rising in pitch. I'm a police officer. You don't have jurisdiction over me. Collins let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about jurisdiction, Stevens. This is about accountability, and right now you're accountable to us. The female agent stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs from her belt. Hands up, she repeated firmly. Todd's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stared at the cuffs, his mind clearly racing for a way out. He raised his hands slowly, his movements jerky and reluctant as the agent secured the cuffs around his wrists. He muttered under his breath, his words barely audible but dripping with venom. This isn't over. Collins stepped closer, leaning in so that only Todd could hear him. You're right about one thing, he said quietly, his tone laced with cold finality. It's not over, it's just beginning. Todd's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The female agent guided him toward the back of the field unit SV, opening the door and ushering him inside. The other agent remained by the vehicle, his gaze scanning the area as though assessing the scene for any potential threats or loose ends. Collins turned back to Renee, his expression softening slightly. You did good work tonight, he said. It's not easy staying Composed in situations like this, Renee gave a small nod, though her expression remained neutral. "Just doing my job, sir." Collins studied her for a moment, then nodded in return. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll debrief in the morning." Renee watched as Collins and the other agents returned to their vehicles, the engines humming to life as the small convoy prepared to leave the field. Unit SV carrying Todd pulled out first, its taillights disappearing into the night. Collins's sub followed closely behind, leaving the parking lot silent once again. For a moment Renee stood alone. The events of the night were playing in her mind, her body AED from the physical altercation, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the encounter was beginning to wear off, leaving her feeling drained. She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs, and glanced down at the spot where Todd had been pinned to the ground. She wasn't naive. She knew that tonight's events were just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Men like Todd didn't operate in a vacuum. Their actions were often enabled, excused, or ignored by a system that was supposed to hold them accountable. But tonight at least there had been a reckoning, and while it wasn't a complete victory, it was a step in the right direction. Renee bent down to pick up the water bottle she had dropped earlier, brushing off the dirt before taking a long sip. The faint hum of traffic in the distance reminded her that the city was still alive, still moving forward. Even in the wake of chaos, she glanced at her car, then at the empty street beyond, and felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over her. This wasn't the first time she had faced injustice, and it wouldn't be the last, but as long as she had the strength to stand her ground, she would continue to fight, because that was what she did. It was who she was, and no one, not even a man like Todd Stevens, could take that away from her. Renee watched the convoy of FBI vehicles disappear into the distance, the taillights fading like embers in the night. The parking lot fell silent save for the faint hum of the gas stations buzzing fluorescent lights. For a brief moment she allowed herself to exhale, her body finally acknowledging the toll of the confrontation. Her muscles ached, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the altercation now left her feeling heavy and worn. She glanced around, assessing her surroundings with the careful precision that had become second nature after years in the field. The lot was empty now, but she knew better than to let her guard down completely. She retrieved her phone from the car and sent a brief message to her team, updating them that the operation was complete. Despite the victory, Renee's mind churned with an uneasy energy. Todd Stevens had been taken into custody, but she knew the story was far from over. Men like him didn't go down quietly. His venomous words and unwavering sense of entitlement lingered in her thoughts, a constant reminder of the arrogance that fueled his actions. She had no doubt that he would try to twist the narrative, painting himself as the victim of some orchestrated conspiracy. The system often allowed men like Stevens to slip through its cracks, but Renee had no intention of letting that happen. The faint sound of an approaching vehicle snapped her back to attention. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted the glow of headlights rounding the corner. For a moment her hand instinctively moved toward her waistband where her concealed firearm was holstered, but as the car came into view her tension eased. It was a standard police cruiser, its lights off and moving at a slow, deliberate pace. Renee recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to one of the local precinct patrol units. Her instincts told her that Todd's arrest had already set off ripples within the department, and now the aftershocks were beginning to hit. The cruiser pulled into the lot and came to a stop a few yards away from her. Two officers stepped out, one older with a seasoned air of authority and the other younger, his nervous energy evident in the way he fidgeted with his duty belt. The older officer, whose name tag read Lieutenant Harris, approached first. His expression was cautious but not hostile, his eyes scanning her face as though trying to piece together the situation. "Agent Carter?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with curiosity. Renee gave a small nod, standing her ground. "That's me." Harris' eyes flicked to the ground where Todd's baton still lay discarded. He let out a quiet sigh, then met her gaze again. "We received word from the FBI field office about what went down here tonight. They briefed us on Officer Stevens' situation." Renee didn't miss the hesitation in his voice. It wasn't just the careful phrasing, it was the subtle way his eyes shifted as though weighing his words before committing to them. She had encountered this type of reaction before, the delicate balance between acknowledging the gravity of misconduct and the instinct to protect the reputation of the department. Still, she appreciated that Harris hadn't immediately jumped to Stevens' defense. "I assume you're here to secure the scene," Renee said, her voice calm but firm. "Or are you here to ask questions?" Harris tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Both, I suppose," he admitted. "We're here to ensure everything's handled by the book." "Stevens as well. Let's just say this isn't the first time we've had to answer for his behavior." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Harris and Renee. He seemed out of his depth, caught between the gravity of the situation and the weight of the uniform he wore. Renee decided to address the elephant in the room directly. "Lieutenant," she said, her tone unwavering, I'm not interested in departmental politics or internal dynamics. What happened tonight is on record and it's not going away. Stevens made his choices and now he'll face the consequences. Harris nodded slowly, his expression grim. Understood, he said, but you should know this could get messy. Stevens is friends in the department, powerful ones. They're not going to take this lying down. Renee raised an eyebrow, her posture remaining relaxed but her eyes sharp. Is that a warning? Harris shook his head. It's a reality check. Men like Stevens don't go down without a fight and they don't fight fair. Renee studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of duplicity in his words, but Harris' demeanor remained steady, his expression sincere. He wasn't making excuses, he was stating a fact. She appreciated the honesty, even if it confirmed her suspicions about the challenges that lay ahead. I faced worse, Renee replied simply, and I'm still standing. Harris let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Fair enough, he said, just watch you're back with that. He gestured to the younger officer who moved to secure the area marking the scene for evidence collection. Harris lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on Renee as though trying to gauge what kind of person she was. Finally he nodded once and turned back toward the cruiser. As the patrol car pulled away, Renee felt the weight of the night settling on her shoulders. She knew Harris was right, this was only the beginning. Stevens wouldn't go down without dragging as many people as he could into the mud with him. His allies would push back, questioning her actions, her credibility, and even her motives, but Renee was prepared for the fight. She had spent years navigating the murky waters of law enforcement politics, and she knew how to stay afloat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Special Agent Collins. Debrief at 0800. Intel suggests Stevens' network may be larger than anticipated. Be ready. Renee frowned, her mind immediately shifting into analytical mode. Stevens' network. The implication was clear. Todd's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. If there were others like him operating within the department, it meant the corruption ran deeper than she had initially realized. This wasn't just about one rogue officer, it was about a system that enabled and protected him. She tapped out a quick response. Understood, we'll review case notes tonight. Do DOS- and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her exhaustion would have to wait. There was work to be done. As Renee got into her car and started the engine, her gaze drifted to the spot where Todd had OD'd earlier, his arrogance and aggression on full display. She thought about his parting words. This isn't over. He had meant them as a threat, but to Renee they were a promise. This wasn't over. It couldn't be, not until every thread of corruption had been unraveled and men like Todd Stevens were held accountable for their actions. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the empty street. The city lights blurred past her, a kaleidoscope of neon and shadow, as she drove toward the precinct where she would begin piecing together the larger picture. The road ahead was uncertain, but Renee had never been one to shy away from a challenge. If Todd Stevens and his allies thought they could intimidate her into silence, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Renee sat in the conference room at the FBI field office the next morning, her back straight and her hands clasped on the table as she reviewed the preliminary findings from the night. Before a large digital screen at the front of the room displayed a web of interconnected names, dates, and incidents, all tied to Todd Stevens. The more she delved into the evidence, the clearer became. Stevens wasn't just a bad cop, he was part of a deeply entrenched network of corruption that spanned multiple precincts, involving officers, supervisors, and even local politicians. It was a system built on abuse of power, falsified reports, and silenced complaints, all designed to protect those who exploited their authority. Special Agent Collins stood at the head of the table, addressing the team of agents assembled for the debriefing. His tone was measured, but the urgency in his words was unmistakable. Last night confirmed what we've suspected for months, he said, gesturing toward the screen. Stevens is just one piece of the puzzle. He's a symptom of a much larger disease. Our objective now is to dismantle the entire operation. We can't just focus on him, we have to go after everyone who enabled him. Renee listened intently, her mind already working through the implications. She had suspected that Stevens wasn't acting alone, but seeing the extent of the network laid out in front of her was sobering. The timeline stretched back years, with dozens of incidents flagged as questionable or unresolved. Complaints from civilians had been buried, evidence had been tampered with, and internal investigations have been quietly dropped. It was a well-oiled machine designed to shield those in power from accountability. As Collins continued to outline the next steps, Renee's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from the TCH team. Stevens is talking. Her eyebrows lifted slightly and she raised her hand to interrupt. Sir, she said, her voice calm but firm, we just got word Stevens is cooperating. The room went silent for a moment as all eyes turned to her. Collins nodded, his expression unreadable. What's he saying? Renee tapped a few keys on her laptop, pulling up the live feed from the interrogation room where Stevens was being held. The screen shifted to show him sitting at a metal table, his wrists shackled in front of him. He looked disheveled, his face pale and his hair damp with sweat. The bravado he had displayed the night before was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that betrayed his fear. An FBI interrogator sat across from him, his posture relaxed but his tone sharp. "You know how this works, Stevens," the interrogator said. "You cooperate and we consider leniency. You stonewall us and you'll take the full brunt of this on your own. So let's start with the basics. Who's pulling the strings?" Stevens hesitated, his gaze darting toward the camera in the corner of the room. He swallowed hard before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lieutenant Harris," he said. "He's the one who gives the orders." Renee's stomach tightened at the mention of Harris' name. She had spoken to him just hours ago, and while she had sensed his unease, she hadn't pegged him as the mastermind behind the corruption. But now that she thought about it, his warning about Stevens' friends in the department seemed less like a cautionary statement and more like an attempt to cover his tracks. On the screen, the interrogator leaned forward, pressing Stevens for more. "Harris isn't the only one," Stevens added quickly, as though trying to distance himself from sole responsibility. "There's a whole group of them. They call it the Inner Circle. They cover for each other, fix reports, intimidate witnesses, make sure no one outside the department asks too many questions." Collins leaned against the table, his expression darkening as he listened. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "We need to act fast before they start covering their tracks." Renee nodded in agreement. "If Harris is involved, we're dealing with someone who knows how to manipulate the system from the inside. He's not just a dirty cop, he's a strategist, and if Stevens is right about this Inner Circle, then they'll be circling the wagons as we speak." Collins straightened, his voice taking on a commanding tone. "All right, here's what we're going to do, Renee. I want you to focus on Harris. Gather everything we have on him, records, complaints, connections. If he's the linchpin, we need to take him out first. The rest you start digging into the other names on this list. I want every single one of them under surveillance." By the end of the day, the team dispersed quickly, the room buzzing with energy as agents moved to their stations. Renee stayed behind, her eyes fixed on the screen as Stevens continued to unravel the network of corruption. Each name he mentioned was another thread to pull, another lead to follow, but her focus remained on Harris. She played their conversation in her mind, scrutinizing every word, every nuance of his tone and body language. Had he been trying to warn her, or was he simply trying to gauge how much she knew? By the time she returned to her desk, the tech team had already compiled a preliminary report on Harris. It was worse than she had anticipated. The file was thick with allegations ranging from excessive use of force to financial impropriety, but none of the complaints had ever stuck. Witnesses had recanted, evidence had gone missing, and investigations had been quietly closed. It was a textbook case of systemic corruption, and Harris had clearly mastered the art of self-preservation. Renee's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Collins. She answered immediately. "What the update?" he asked. "We've got enough on Harris to bring him in," she replied, "but if we want to take down the entire Inner Circle, we need to play this carefully. If we move too soon, they'll scatter." Collins was silent for a moment, then said, "Agreed. Let's bring Harris in quietly. I don't want anyone tipping off the others." Renee's heart raced as she prepared for the operation. This was the moment where everything could either come together or fall apart. Harris was the key, but he was also the most dangerous piece on the board. If he suspected they were onto him, he wouldn't hesitate to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or even go on the offensive. But Renee wasn't about to let that happen. Later that evening, she and a small team of agents waited in an unmarked van parked outside Harris' home. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with well-maintained houses that gave no hint of the secrets hiding within. Renee adjusted her earpiece, her gaze fixed on the front door as Collins's voice crackled through the comms. "We've got eyes on him. Stand by for my signal." Minutes felt like hours as they waited, the tension in the van palpable. Finally the front door opened and Harris stepped out, his movements casual as he walked toward his cargo. Collins ordered. The team moved swiftly, surrounding Harris before he could react. Renee was the first to reach him, her badge outstretched as she addressed him with calm authority. "Lieutenant Harris, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power." Harris froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. For a moment he looked as though he might resist, but then he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down Renee's spine. "You have no idea what you've just started," he said quietly. Renee didn't respond. She watched as the agents cuffed him and led him to the waiting vehicle, her mind already racing with the implications of his words. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. The system wasn't perfect, but tonight it had worked, and as long as she had the strength to fight, she would make sure it kept working. The room was tense with anticipation as Renee sat at the head of the long conference table reviewing the final reports from the operation. It had been 48 hours since Harris' arrest, and the fallout was already rippling through the precinct and beyond. The inner circle of corrupt officers was unraveling at an astonishing pace. Every new piece of evidence, every confession, and every uncovered document added weight to the case, painting a damning picture of a system rotting from within. Harris' initial smirk at his arrest had faded by the time he entered the interrogation room. Despite his outward bravado, he hadn't anticipated how thoroughly the FBI had prepared. Within hours, his financial records, falsified reports, and even encrypted messages tying him to the network had been laid bare. His lawyer had tried to delay proceedings, but the weight of the evidence and the threat of harsher sentencing if he didn't cooperate forced his hand. Harris confessed not everything, not at first, but enough to confirm Stevens' claims and implicate several high-ranking officers in the precinct. The so-called inner circle had been his brainchild, a web of alliances built on mutual cover-ups, intimidation, and exploitation. They had falsified reports, planted evidence, and coerced witnesses to protect themselves and silence anyone who challenged their authority. In exchange for leniency, Harris provided names, dates, and specific incidents that the FBI could use to build an airtight case. Now, with the dust settling, the magnitude of the operation became clear. Renee and her team had uncovered a sprawling network of corruption that extended far beyond Stevens and Harris. Multiple precincts, local politicians, and even members of the district attorney's office were implicated. It was a scandal that would rock the city to its core, and Renee was at the center of it. Collins entered the conference room, his expression grim but determined. He placed a thick file in front of Renee and sat down beside her. "It's done," he said simply. "The DA's office is preparing charges against everyone we've named so far. Harris has agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Stevens," he paused, shaking his head, "he's not going to see the outside of a cell for a very long time." Renee nodded, though her satisfaction was tempered by the weight of what they had uncovered. "It's a win," she said, her voice steady but subdued. "But it's just the beginning." Collins raised an eyebrow. Meaning there's still work to do," Renee replied. She gestured toward the screen displaying a flow chart of the corruption network. "This isn't just about one precinct or one group of officers, it's about a culture that allowed this to happen, a system that protected them." Collins leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he considered her words. "You're not wrong," he admitted, "but we've taken out some of the biggest players. That's going to send a message." Renee's lips pressed into a thin line. "Messages don't mean anything if no one's listening. We need systemic change, not just arrests." Collins studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You've got a point. What's your plan?" She hesitated, the weight of responsibility settling over her like a heavy cloak. "We need to work with internal affairs to conduct a full audit of every precinct connected to this case, every complaint that was buried, every investigation that was dropped. It all needs to be reopened, and we need to ensure that the officers who come forward to testify are protected. If we don't back them up, we're just encouraging the same culture of silence." Collins gave a low whistle. "That's ambitious." "It has to be," Renee said firmly. "If we stop now, we're just putting a band-aid on a bullet wound." Collins nodded again, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'll talk to the brass," he said, "but you better be ready to lead this charge. Once word gets out, people are going to look to you." Renee stiffened slightly at the thought. She wasn't one for the spotlight, preferring to let her work speak for itself, but she also knew that Collins was right. Her role in exposing the corruption had made her a figurehead for change, whether she wanted it or not, and if that meant taking on more responsibility to ensure real reform, she was willing to do it. "Let me know what they say," she said finally, her voice calm but resolute. "I'll be ready." As Collins left the room, Renee leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a brief moment of reflection. The past few days had been a whirlwind of tension, conflict, and revelations. She thought about Todd Stevens, his arrogance and hatred masking a deep-seated insecurity. She thought about Harris, a man who had once sworn an oath to protect and serve, now reduced to a broken shell scrambling to save himself. And she thought about the countless victims whose voices had been silenced by the corruption. She had uncovered. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. One of her colleagues, Agent Rivera, stepped inside holding a tablet. "Renee," she said, her tone urgent, "you need to see this." Renee frowned as Rivera placed the tablet in front of her. The screen displayed a live news broadcast, the headline scrolling across the bottom in bold letters: "Widespread police corruption scandal exposed. FBI investigation leads to multiple arrests." The footage cut to a press conference where the mayor stood, flanked by the police commissioner and several city officials. The mayor's expression was somber as he addressed the crowd. "What we've learned over the past few days is nothing short of shocking," he said. "The actions of a few have tarnished the reputation of an entire department. But let me be clear, this is not the end. We will not tolerate corruption in any form, and we will take every step necessary to rebuild trust with the community." The camera panned to a group of protesters gathered outside the precinct, their signs bearing messages like "Justice for all" and "Hold them Accountable, the crowd was peaceful but resolute, their chants a powerful reminder of the stakes. Renee felt a flicker of hope as she watched the broadcast. The city was waking up, people were demanding change, and while there was still a long road ahead, the momentum was undeniable. Rivera spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "You did this," she said. "You started this." Renee shook her head slightly. "We did this," she corrected, "and now we need to finish it." That night, as Renee returned home, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She stood on her balcony looking out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars against the dark canvas of the sky. The weight of the operation still lingered, but for the first time in days she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point, and while the fight was far from over, Renee knew she was exactly where she needed to be. With resolve burning in her chest, she turned and stepped back inside, ready to face whatever came next.